You cross $100,000 a year, and you expect something to feel different. Not externally, because your environment may not change immediately, but internally, where you assume a certain level of control should begin to appear. You imagine clarity. You imagine stability. You imagine that the financial pressure you once felt will finally loosen its grip. Instead, something quieter happens. Your expenses don't spike all at once. Your lifestyle doesn't transform overnight. There is no dramatic shift you can point to. But the way you think about money begins to change, in small, almost invisible ways. And those changes carry consequences that compound over time. At $100,000, you are no longer operating in survival mode, but you are not yet operating with true financial leverage. You exist in a middle layer where income feels sufficient, yet still finite. And this is where one of the most subtle psychological traps begins to form. You start treating money less as a constraint and more as a tool for convenience. You notice it first in decisions that feel justified. You pay for time. You avoid inconvenience. You choose slightly better options because the difference seems negligible relative to your income. A higher subscription here, a more comfortable purchase there, a quicker solution instead of a more efficient one. None of these decisions feel irresponsible in isolation. In fact, they often feel earned. But the pattern is not in the individual decision. The pattern is in how frequently you make them. The difference between a $12 option and a $20 option is not significant when you earn $100,000. But when that difference appears across dozens of categories, repeated across months, it begins to restructure your baseline cost of living without you ever consciously deciding to increase it. You are not spending recklessly. You are adjusting quietly. And this is where the threshold reveals itself. Below this level, spending decisions are filtered through necessity. Above it, they begin to pass through comfort. The transition between those two states is not marked by a clear line. It is defined by the gradual removal of friction. Friction is what forces evaluation. It slows you down. It makes you compare. It makes you calculate. When friction disappears, so does the pause that protects you from unnecessary cost. At $100,000, many of your decisions lose that pause. You begin to outsource small inconveniences without tracking their cumulative impact. You default to faster solutions instead of better ones. You reduce the number of decisions that require effort. And in doing so, you reduce the number of moments where optimization could occur. The system does not push back against this behavior. In fact, it quietly encourages it. Pricing structures are designed to feel insignificant at this level of income. Subscriptions are broken into monthly payments. Premium options are positioned just slightly above standard ones. Convenience is framed as efficiency. The difference is always small enough to ignore, but consistent enough to accumulate. And so your financial life begins to drift. Not dramatically, not visibly, but structurally. Your savings rate does not collapse. It compresses. The margin you once had begins to narrow, not because your income decreased, but because your baseline expanded. This is the part that is rarely discussed. The $100,000 threshold does not create financial freedom. It creates financial flexibility without discipline. And flexibility without structure tends to be absorbed by lifestyle rather than converted into leverage. You feel stable, but your system has not changed. You still rely on income. You still exchange time for money. You still operate within a framework where your progress depends on consistency rather than compounding. Meanwhile, someone earning the same income can experience a completely different outcome, not because they are more disciplined in a traditional sense, but because they interpret the same threshold differently. They do not see $100,000 as permission to spend more comfortably. They see it as the first moment where excess can be redirected with intention. Where you remove friction, they preserve it. They still pause before decisions that appear small. They still evaluate options that seem insignificant, not because they cannot afford the difference, but because they understand that repeated differences form structure. They treat convenience as a trade-off, not a default. And this is where the divergence begins. It does not show up in a single purchase. It does not reveal itself in a single month. It appears gradually across years as one version of your financial life becomes easier and the other becomes more efficient. You may not notice it immediately. Both versions pay their bills. Both versions maintain a reasonable lifestyle. Both versions feel stable. But one is quietly increasing its cost base, while the other is quietly building capacity. And capacity is what changes outcomes. Capacity is not just savings, it is optionality. It is the ability to decide when to spend, when to invest, and when to wait. It is the difference between reacting to financial pressure and positioning yourself ahead of it. The $100,000 threshold is the first point where capacity becomes possible for many people, but it is also the point where it is most easily lost, because nothing forces you to build it. There is no immediate consequence for not optimizing. There is no penalty for choosing convenience. There is no visible signal that your system is drifting. Everything continues to function, and that is precisely what makes the shift difficult to detect. You are not making mistakes. You are making trade-offs that remain invisible until they accumulate. Over time, those trade-offs define your trajectory. Your cost of living rises slowly. Your expectations adjust. Your definition of normal expands. And eventually, the income that once felt like a breakthrough becomes just enough to sustain the structure you have built. You reach a point where earning more feels necessary, not strategic. And this is where many people misinterpret the problem. They assume the solution is higher income, and while income matters, the underlying system often remains unchanged. Without awareness, the same pattern repeats at a higher level. More income creates more flexibility, and more flexibility is absorbed by the same behaviors that shaped the previous stage. The threshold moves, but the structure stays the same. And this is why the $100,000 mark is not just financial. It is psychological. It changes how you evaluate cost. It changes how you perceive value. It changes how often you allow small decisions to pass without scrutiny. And those changes influence everything that follows. Once you begin to see this, your behavior does not need to change dramatically. The shift is not in restriction. It is in awareness. You start to notice where convenience replaces intention. You recognize where small differences repeat. You become more selective, not because you have to, but because you understand what those decisions create over time. You rebuild friction where it matters, not to limit yourself, but to preserve the moments where better decisions are made. Because at this level, the outcome is no longer determined by what you earn. It is determined by how you structure what you keep. And that structure is built, one decision at a time, often in places that feel too small to matter, until they do. There is no clear signal when you cross this threshold, no notification, no external marker. The system continues exactly as it did before, but your position within it has changed. You now have access to a margin that can either expand your future or quietly dissolve into your present. Both outcomes feel the same in the beginning. Both feel stable. Both feel justified. Both feel normal. The difference only becomes visible later, when one version of your life begins to compound and the other continues to maintain. And by the time that difference becomes obvious, the underlying pattern has already been repeated hundreds of times. The question is not whether $100,000 is enough. The question is whether you recognize what it allows you to do before that opportunity is absorbed by how you choose to live. Because the threshold does not change your financial future on its own. It changes the way you make decisions. And those decisions, repeated quietly over time, are what determine everything that follows.